Hi, my name is Tyler, and I'm going to be doing Chapter 9, which is called Cultural Connections. The first slide is Edwin A. Hodgson. It's a picture of him, and then the third slide, is a little bit more about him. He was the second president of the National Association for the Deaf, and he taught printing at the New York School for the Deaf. So he edited what is often referred to as the excellent Deaf Mutes Journal, which we have a very bad quality photo on to the right of the slide. And that's an example of an independent newspaper for the deaf. The little papers, on the other hand, were a little bit different. The North Carolina Institution for the Deaf and the Blind released the Deaf Mute, and then after the Civil War, other deaf schools followed suit and began creating more newspapers like the Deaf Mute. And eventually, all these papers came together and created what is called the Little Paper family, or now it's referred to as just the Little Papers. Almost 50 newspapers were across the country being made for and by deaf people. And these newspapers were nice because it provided vocational training for the students and teachers that were in charge of making these newspapers, because they had to write, edit, and print, and also release all of these newspapers by themselves. And then it also offered some cultural connections for deaf people, so that way they weren't completely out of the loop. And like I just mentioned, they had, independent newspapers or the little papers, and the little papers gained a lot of popularity because it was by and for deaf people, which was appealing. So the little papers had these cultural guidance columns, and it basically advised deaf people on how to behave, essentially, to gain more respect and reliability and trust from hearing people. And one of the quotes that I found that I liked, because I feel like it kind of describes a lot of people's situations, even now, is a deaf mute has to run the race of life under a heavy handicap, and he cannot afford to load himself with any extra weight. And that extra weight being biases that hearing people might have against them. For example, people would see one drunk Irish person in public, and then everybody suddenly thought that all Irish people drank way too much. And that was a bias that Irish people still kind of have to hold on to. So that extra weight can really affect the way people make it through this world. So the next slide is about the gossip columns. Now, when we hear gossip today, it's like, oh, it's bad, it's dishonest, it's lying. But these gossip columns were more of a means of getting to know what's going on, say, in Texas, if you live in Indiana. You got to find out what was going on. So you got to hear about births, you got to hear about marriages or deaths, you got to hear about if a building burned down, or if they were building a new building. So we got to hear all about that from these gossip columns. And then, of course, these little papers did not come without any controversy. Even though they were run by deaf people and made for deaf people, the institutions that supplied these people the tools to make these papers were run by hearing people. And an example is an editor, James W. Sowell, who was an editor for the Nebraska Journal. He strongly disagreed with a bill that would mandate oralism as opposed to sign language to be taught in deaf classrooms. He was very strongly against this, but when the bill passed, he realized that his position as an editor was jeopardized. And then Frank W. Booth, who is known for basically hating sign language, became the superintendent of the school that James W. Sowell worked at. And he ended up refusing to address the topic of oralism after he became superintendent, and the rare occasions that he did bring it up, he was more in a favorable position of it because he could lose his job otherwise. So that's the last slide that I have for it, but essentially the little papers allowed deaf people to have a better means of access to gain information from other deaf people. And it allowed them to have a sense of unity as opposed to feeling kind of alone. And the and the papers allowed people who, even if they were surrounded by supportive deaf people, that in their small community, it still allowed them to have access to a bigger community, which is, I think, nice for anybody to have. So, yeah, that was my presentation.